All right, next topic is API testing and service virtualization. My name is Robert Wagner, and I will give you a short demo on the topics where I'm responsible for at Tricentis. Anyone who ever tried API testing probably experienced that this is not so easy like with UI testing, right? Because UIs are made for humans, and if we do test automation on a UI, we're simply automating stuff we're doing usually manually, right? Or typing in and so on and so forth. With API testing, we don't have an UI, right? But, and it's quite technical as well. And that's kind of a problem to get started if you're not familiar with an API, right? So what we did and what we decided to do is that we have different skill sets in this process. Like this is the Agile DevOps cycle, where stories get created, but a developer implements it, for instance, for a service, for an API, right? So the developer actually knows how to access this API, and is also familiar with the technical challenge, actually. So the developer creates initial tests with our so-called API scan. And you can open the API scan by clicking the button up here. And so he gets started with the whole topic if you're, for instance, not familiar or not technical enough. So if you have friends in the development, for instance, you can share this API scan. It's not licensed. You can share it it's free. And you just can ask this guy, could you do a couple steps on this API to get me started? Because if something already works there, you can move it directly into Tosca. And this is what I will show you. So this is the API scan. And I will scan a schema definition for a service I'm running locally here on my machine. It's a coincidence that I'm using also a vehicle service like Jonathan. But you know, when you scan, this is the API scan, you can scan WSDL files, Swagger files, definitions, etc. But of course, you can also model request and response pairs manually. And in this case, I just scan the WSDL file, and the API scan creates messages for you. It inserts the endpoint, it chooses the right method, resource, etc. So it creates everything out of the definition, not only for the request, but also for the response. So out of a definition, you could already get started. But of course, the API scan, for instance, allows also to send a message to the service, for instance. And if I type in here, for instance, BMW, and send it, then I get like the information about the BMW back. That's usually required if you want, for instance, as a developer, if you want to check the interface, you just do one try, right? That's sufficient. From a functional perspective, you should test more, of course, right? But this is what usually developers do. And in the past, or if you're not having like this tool support, that you can move it to the next skill level, which is the functional test automation, these artifacts usually get lost, right? The developers, they don't continue or proceed with this, and it's hard to move it to the next level. But if you use Tosca, for instance, you can click on this button here, which means you can export this as an API test case to Tosca in order to get like modules. As we can see here, we get your modules for the same messages, of course, and also test cases. And from here, you can link it to test data sources, to execution lists, to your requirements sections, and run it in your nightly CI, for instance. So which means we move it to the next level where we deal with functional testing. And you know, the functional testing has, you know, they need to maintain also these test cases, they need to update them, and so on and so forth. But since the API test case still is quite technical, what we're doing is we abstract the relevant information we're interested in. Because, you know, we don't want to deal always with the technical complexity of APIs. We want to test from a functional perspective, so we abstract the relevant information. And I'm doing this by creating these attributes here. And I'll do this for the response as well. So you see, when I click on these attributes here, actually it points to the fields in the XML itself. Of course, this works the same for JSON and other protocols like fixed length protocols, which are used for mainframe, for instance. But what we're basically doing is we're exposing the functional relevant data for us to have it to reduce the noise. So when I close this, the modules and go to the test case section. For those of you who are not familiar with this, the modules is the technical representation, while the blue section is the functional, where we fill in the values, all the different variations. So this is the request and response pair, and I just will populate it with some values. And you see, you can now access this API from a functional level. So you don't even need to care if it's a REST API or if it's a SOAP API or anything else with JMS, for instance. So abstraction is very important for us after the collaboration part, right? So the getting started was like the technical guys, we bring them on board, and then we do the abstraction in order to enable people who are not familiar with techniques or APIs at all, which usually do manual testing on a user frontend, for instance, but they can read this, right? And you can even change, the idea is to create like a user interface. For instance, you can change the names here. Of course, you can change names here to give it a better functional meaning if you hand over the test later, that the people understand what's going on, right? And it always used to be a problem. When I used to be a consultant, I was doing exactly the same. I was like reaching out to developers and then try to model everything in Tosca then. So this is not necessary anymore, right? So you just click on one button and we make sure that the test case gets exactly the same executed as the developer did it. So there is no the possibility of misunderstanding gets just significantly decreased, right? All right, that's how you create an API test case. But my topic is also service virtualization. And therefore we need to understand when we do API testing, we're sending requests to a system, then we're receiving responses, which we verify, right? And in service virtualization, it's just vice versa. It's like we're receiving a request and we return the response, but the messages are the same, right? We're just switching the perspective. So I'm going back to my API scan, and I'm having a UI here, for instance, which deals with this vehicle service, for instance. And if I have no service available, and I choose something here, I experience that the service is not available, and this is like a #1 killer for automation. If you run some tests on your UI and the backend is not there or the wrong data is there. And this is exactly where you use service virtualization. And I just will tell you how we can fix this very easily. And we used to call this internally service virtualization in a minute, because you scan in the WSDL, you get the message pairs generated by the scan, and then you simply upload this to OSV, which is our virtualization server. So when I click here on upload, it's already uploaded. I can see here in my OSV monitor that the get car example is available, and for BMW. So if I choose BMW, for instance, I will get the responses here, and I will be able to test like this control here. Otherwise, this control would not be accessible because there's no data in there, right? And this is what I just did with service virtualization. And of course, sometimes you need more sophisticated stuff, like stateful data or dynamic values in there. And therefore, you would move everything to Tosca Commander, where you model like stateful flows or even model scenarios which are accessing different systems. But how do I bring these scenarios to Tosca? There are two options. The one is I can mark this scenario for input into Tosca. So when I go here and I click on my OSV ribbon, I can import the marked scenario, for instance. And I see exactly how the flow is. I receive like the request and it will return a response. And this is like the data, this is like the pattern matching we're using in our service virtualization. This is what we perform actually when we receive a request. Right? So that's the pattern matching. We are using the action mode wait on for this, which means if our service virtualization receives a request on the resource car service, the method post, and it's BMW, it will respond with the different vehicles. So let me just give you another example. For instance, for Volkswagen. And let's say these guys doing like, I don't know, test power. So we're going to upload this. So we have now a second scenario loaded. And you know, if we access this, then we can manipulate basically the data as we like, even if this is in an actual test system not even possible. So you can also do like negative testing, or you can send invalid responses, for instance, if you like, if you want to test it for more robust. All right. So that was about service virtualization. And in Tosca, reuse is very important, right? It's not only reusing test data for different technologies. It also, if you have like an API test case, and that's already explained, the messages are the same basically. You can take a test case and you can convert it directly into a virtualization. You see, this was basically the API test case. I took it simply and converted into a service virtualization, which means if I do integration testing, I'm testing with the API test case and testing the service. And if I need to test the UI, I simply convert this API test case, and I have the same thing for service virtualization available. So when I will connect these two systems, then I can make sure that both are speaking the same language, because it's coming out of the same message, so I can't really mess it up, right? And once you have this all brought to Tosca, and you can use it and can run it, of course, in your continuous integration and in the nightly CI, for instance. And of course, from there, it basically starts for API testing and service virtualization the same as for UI testing or for any other technology in Tosca, which means you can link these test cases to templates, like I did it here, or to test data sources. And out of these test data sources, you can automatically create instances of test cases. And of course, you can link this to requirements, which when you execute this, these test results directly get like referenced into the requirements, where you have immediately a status of the health of your product. Also with risk-based testing and so on. So which means also the risk-based testing approach makes sense for API testing, because when you start doing API testing, you will have a lot of more test results, right? Because they run much faster API tests. But you know, then you need to find different approaches how to analyze this more smart, and risk-based testing is one of these approaches, that you go for the failed results first, which have the highest priority or the highest risk actually. So this is, you can link this, you can model this as you're used to with all the techniques in Tosca. And I also want to give you an example about a service virtualization project where we basically captured the traffic during a login, and for service virtualization, which means we also can deal with all kind of different services. Like in a microservice infrastructure, it's very likely that you have many different calls to many different systems, and all is completely unpredictable, non-sequenced messaging, and that's what actually recorded and then modeled. And you can do this in a couple of hours in order to record the traffic and simply provide it as a virtual service, even if it has the complexity like this. So if we go a little bit into this OSV scenario, we can see we're also using here like non-sequence block, which means we can also deal with completely asynchronous communication, while normally it all gets processed and the flow as we just have it modeled here. So you see, there is no programming required in Tosca in order to simulate like the most complex flows, where you have like 300 plus calls just for a login, for instance, right? And you can simulate like the whole login, Or you just can intercept certain calls. For instance, if only one backend or one service in the backend is not available, you can just virtualize this one as well, while passing the rest through to the real application, for instance, right? So you can probably intercept calls to a certain service to trigger a certain situation, for instance, on your front end. So you basically bring the backend into your control without the need for any programming, right? So that's very important for us, that we give service virtualization also to an audience which is not so technical, and especially not to program. Because if you need to program a virtual service, then it actually, it doesn't really make too much sense anymore, because I rather take the developers and let them work on the real application, right? So with Tosca, it's possible to model this all with the same approaches like with the model-based. So the modules are there for the maintenance, the same procedure for service virtualization as well. Well, that's it from my side. If you have any questions, we're over there at the booth, and we're happy to answer your questions there. Thank you.